This is the story of the African elephant, the largest land animal on Earth, and how it fell from more than 1 million animals to fewer than 500,000 in a single human lifetime, and why, after decades of collapse, the numbers are finally starting to move the other way. Every figure in this video comes from published survey data, the IUCN Red List, and national wildlife censuses. The picture they paint is honest, complicated, and more hopeful than it has been in 40 years. Before the collapse, it's worth knowing what kind of animal we're talking about. Elephants belong to an ancient order called Proboscidia, whose first members appeared in Africa around 60 million years ago, some of them no bigger than a large dog. That long line produced mammoths, mastodons, and dozens of other species, and today only 3 survive: the African savanna elephant, the African forest elephant, and the Asian elephant. Everything else is extinct. The largest land animal alive, with big bulls standing 3 to 4 meters at the shoulder and weighing up to 6 tons. The largest one ever reliably recorded was a male shot in Angola in November of 1955, so enormous that his mounted body has stood in the rotunda of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History since 1959. Known as the Feni-Kovi elephant, he measured over 4 meters at the shoulder and weighed an estimated 10 tons, and he remains the largest land mammal on display anywhere in the world. A wild elephant can live 60 to 70 years, close to a human lifespan, and the oldest on record reached their late 80s. Its trunk contains no bone at all, but tens of thousands of muscle bundles, enough to uproot a tree or pick up a single seed, and it doubles as a snorkel. So elephants are strong swimmers that can cross rivers with only the trunk tip above the surface. For an animal this size, almost nothing in the wild is a threat, and a grown elephant has no natural predators. The one danger that has ever truly mattered to it is the one this video is about. Start with the scale of what was lost. Before European colonization, the African continent may have held as many as 20 million elephants, ranging across nearly every habitat from the Cape to the Sahara. By 1930, that number had fallen to roughly 10 million, and by 1979, the first reliable continent-wide estimate counted around 1.3 million elephants. That figure, 1.3 million, is the highest confirmed number of the modern era, and it is the baseline against which everything that followed gets measured. What happened next was one of the fastest declines of a large animal ever recorded. Through the 1980s, the international ivory trade exploded, and by 1989, the African elephant population had crashed to roughly 600,000 animals. In a single decade, more than half of all the elephants on the continent were killed, most of them for their tusks. That year, 1989, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, banned the international ivory trade outright. It was the turning point that began to slow the bleeding, though not everywhere, and not all at once. The damage by then was structural. Over the past century, African elephant populations had dropped by an estimated 90%. The forest elephant, the smaller species living in the dense rainforests of Central Africa, declined by more than 86% in just 31 years. The savanna elephant, the iconic animal of the open plains, fell by at least 60% over 50 years. These were not gradual erosions. They were collapses driven by the ivory trade, by habitat loss, as land was converted to agriculture, and by the simple biological reality that elephants reproduce slowly. A female elephant carries a single calf for 22 months, the longest pregnancy of any mammal, which means that once a population falls, it cannot bounce back quickly, even under the best conditions. For decades, the problem was that nobody had reliable continent-wide numbers. There had not been a Pan-African survey in almost 40 years, and the data that existed was scattered and outdated. That changed in 2016, when the Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen funded the Great Elephant Census, the first ever Pan-African aerial survey of savanna elephants, led by the biologist Mike Chase of Elephants Without Borders. Allen spent more than $7 million on the effort, and over 3 years, survey planes counted 352,271 savanna elephants across 18 countries. The findings were grim. In the 15 countries where researchers could compare against earlier counts, populations had fallen 30% between 2007 and 2014, a loss of around 144,000 elephants in just 7 years, at an annual rate of 8%. The hardest-hit countries were Tanzania and Mozambique, which together lost 73,000 elephants to poaching in only 5 years. Tracking how many elephants are dying and why falls to a program most people have never heard of. The CITES Monitoring the Illegal Killing of Elephants program, known as MIKE, was established in 1997 and runs around 70 monitoring sites across 32 African elephant range states, plus sites across Asia. At each site, ranger patrols record every elephant carcass they find and whether the animal was killed illegally. From that, MIKE calculates a single revealing number: the proportion of illegally killed elephants, or PIKE. When PIKE rises above 1/2, it means more elephants are being killed illegally than are dying of all natural causes combined, a level at which populations decline. At the height of the crisis in 2012, roughly 72% of all elephant deaths recorded were illegal killings. By 2014, that had fallen to 48%, the level at which births begin to outpace deaths. And the overall figure for Africa has continued downward since, with the 2020 estimate, the lowest since 2003. For a long time, scientists treated all African elephants as one species. That changed in March 2021, when the IUCN, drawing on new genetic evidence, formally recognized 2 distinct species for the first time. The African savanna elephant was listed as endangered. The African forest elephant was listed as critically endangered. Before that assessment, both had been grouped together under the single, milder label of vulnerable. The split was not bureaucratic housekeeping. It revealed that the forest elephant hidden in the canopy and far harder to count was in far more serious trouble than anyone had appreciated when the two were lumped together. The ivory trade did more than reduce the number of elephants. In some places, it changed the animals themselves. Decades of hunters targeting the largest tusks meant that elephants born without tusks were more likely to survive and breed, and in heavily poached populations, the proportion of tuskless females climbed far above natural levels. A study published in the journal Science in 2021, led by the Princeton biologist Shane Campbell-Staton and focused on Mozambique's Gorongosa population, traced this to specific genes and confirmed what it meant, that intense poaching can drive a measurable evolutionary shift in a large animal in the span of a single human generation. The tusk, the very thing the poachers wanted, was being selected out of the population. Today, roughly 415,000 to 500,000 African elephants remain across 37 sub-Saharan countries. About 350,000 of those are savanna elephants, and around 135,000 are forest elephants. Around 70% of the entire African elephant population now lives in southern Africa, concentrated in Botswana, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa. The forest elephant tells a more concentrated story still. About 95% of that species lives in Central Africa, with the majority in Gabon and the Republic of Congo. Conservation organizations, including the World Wildlife Fund, have spent decades working across these regions to curb trafficking and reduce demand for ivory. Here's where the story turns, because the recent data carries genuine signs of recovery. In November 2025, at the 20th CITES conference, the IUCN African Elephant Specialist Group released the first status report ever produced solely for the forest elephant. Counting forest elephants had always been the hardest job in the field. The animals live in dense rainforest where they cannot be seen from a plane. So researchers turned to a different method entirely, extracting DNA from elephant dung to identify and count individuals through the canopy. Using that approach, they counted 135,690 forest elephants, a 16% increase over the figures published in 2016. The IUCN was careful about what that number meant. As they put it, the updated count should not be read as population growth, but as the result of better survey methods finally seeing elephants that were always there. Still, the report carried a tone the conservation world had not heard in years. The IUCN's Director General, Grethel Aguilar, said the findings show that conservation action is working for these animals. And then there is Mozambique, which is where this story becomes something more than a list of declines. Mozambique sits on the southeastern coast of Africa, and in the 1970s, before the country's civil war, it held more than 20,000 elephants. The war ran from 1977 to 1992, and during those 15 years, poaching and military culling wiped out roughly 90% of the country's elephants. The recovery that followed was real, but fragile. By 2008, the population had climbed back toward 20,000 before a second wave of ivory poaching cut it down again. From 10,800 animals in 2014 to 9,114 by 2018. What happened next is the reason this video exists. In 2025, Mozambique's National Administration of Conservation Areas carried out the country's first full wildlife census in 7 years. The result, announced in early 2026, was an estimated 21,700 elephants, more than double the 2018 figure. Alongside that number came a sharp drop in the number of elephant carcasses found, which conservation officials pointed to as direct evidence that anti-poaching efforts were working. The country's Minister of Agriculture credited strengthened monitoring, the involvement of local communities in conservation, wildlife reintroduction programs, and the sharing of benefits from protected areas. A population that had been cut nearly in half had not just recovered, it had doubled. No single place captures that turnaround better than Gorongosa National Park. Gorongosa is one of Africa's most inspiring stories of return, a place that was emptied by war, and then, animal by animal, filled itself back in. It sits at the southern end of the Great African Rift Valley in central Mozambique, more than 4,000 square kilometers of floodplain savanna and the forested slopes of Mount Gorongosa. Before the Civil War, the park held roughly 2,200 elephants. By the time the fighting ended, fewer than 200 had survived. The lions told the same story. A pre-war population of about 200 reduced to single digits, with as few as 30 animals left, and many of them carrying injuries from wire snares. The recovery at Gorongosa came through a long-term partnership between the government of Mozambique and the American philanthropist Greg Carr, who pledged more than $100 million over 35 years. The work was slow and unglamorous. Teams removed thousands of wire snares left over from the war. Rangers were hired and trained. Anti-poaching patrols expanded across the entire park. And then nature did what nature does when you give it room. The park's total wildlife population climbed from around 10,000 animals in 2008 to well over 100,000 today. The elephants have rebounded to an all-time high. The lions are back above 200, the same number recorded before the war. Gorongosa now protects over 120 mammal species and nearly 400 species of birds. The recovery was never only about animals. Ecotourism at Gorongosa funds local education, healthcare, and sustainable agriculture, and the park now employs around 1,700 people, most of them Mozambican. The principle behind it has become central to conservation worldwide. That the people living alongside a protected area have to benefit from it, or no amount of outside money will hold it together. Which brings us, finally, to the other side of the world, and to why the African story matters so much. Africa is not the only continent with elephants. Across South and Southeast Asia, the Asian elephant survives in far smaller numbers. Only about 40,000 to 50,000 animals remain in the wild, scattered across 13 countries. India holds the largest share, with roughly 22,000 to 27,000. The Asian elephant is listed as endangered, and it faces the same pressures that drove the African decline. Habitat fragmentation and conflict with people, as expanding human populations push into the forests and corridors elephants need to move through. The Asian elephant situation puts the African numbers in perspective. When you combine every elephant left on Earth, savanna, forest, and Asian, the global total sits somewhere around 450,000 to 470,000 animals. From a historical peak measured in the tens of millions, that is a decline of more than 90%. The elephant, in every form it takes, is a fraction of what it once was. So, where does that leave us? The honest answer holds two truths at once. The African elephant remains endangered, the forest elephant critically so, and the threats that caused the collapse, ivory poaching, habitat loss, human-wildlife conflict, have not disappeared. But for the first time in decades, the most recent data points are moving in the right direction. Mozambique's elephants have doubled. The forest elephant count has risen. Poaching pressure, measured by Mike, has fallen to its lowest level in 2 decades. Regional populations across southern and eastern Africa are stabilizing, and in some places growing. Cross-border conservation areas like the Kaza Transfrontier Zone are giving elephants room to move across national boundaries the way they always have. From more than 1 million animals to fewer than 500,000, from a species split in two by its own decline to a forest elephant count rising for the first time in a generation, from a national herd in Mozambique cut nearly in half to one that doubled in 7 years. The elephant is not saved, but after a century of losing them, the world is finally, in measurable numbers, starting to get some of them back.